Who was the first person you thought of on the morning of July 28, 2022? Maybe it was a family member, a best friend, or maybe someone you just met the day before at a place like this, Hyman Settlement School on the banks of Troublesome Creek in Knight County. We all have that first person. So what is their story? Brandon, I think I know already who the first person you thought of was when this flood was happening.
Yeah, my wife, of course, was at home. My mother-in-law lives right across the yard, so they were definitely the first on my mind. Of course, our dogs, our neighbors. I mean, there were a lot of people that live in my community that I knew would be impacted in a pretty significant way.
And the water got pretty close to your home, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the last pictures that I got from Steph before the power went out, which killed the internet and all communications, was the water approaching my front steps. And that was something to see.
Yeah. How soon before you knew how bad this was?
I had an inkling when we were in the coverage, and I should have suspected that once the reports stopped coming in that it was getting really bad. But when you're in that moment, when you're kind of focused on your job and kind of keeping people safe, I think it's one of those situations where it takes a little while for it to completely set in.
Yeah, and almost immediately you saw neighbors helping neighbors, which we always do after a disaster. This was just on a much bigger scope, I think. Yeah. I mean, and it's still happening today.
Absolutely. Almost a year later, I absolutely seeing the same thing going on. People still rebuilding, people again. And that's the theme of the mountains. I mean, we've been through tornadoes, we've been through devastating flooding, we've been through a little bit of everything natural disaster-wise, and it's always people, even the night of, jumped in to help. They're always, like you said, neighbor helping neighbor. I mean, that's the common theme. That's basically mountain people. That's what they do.
And we keep calling this a historic flood. We don't say that lightly. It literally was historic in areas like Letcher County and Whitesburg, where the river shattered the record.
Right, exactly. So it's one of those situations where that hadn't happened since the flood of '57. That was historic in that way. And of course, the radar estimates from the Weather Service in that span was 14 to 16 inches, most of it that night. So I think it's one of those situations where you're going to see members of the community who kind of want to forget that that happened, but I think it's going to take them a little while to get past that.
Since the morning of July 28, 2022, Eastern Kentuckians have shared the stories of how they survived the rising rivers, creeks, and streams. But for Knott County native Tabitha Noble, the memories of that night are something she hopes to one day forget.
I guess I'm still more or less healing from it, so I don't really look at it as it being something like that.
Noble says flooding had happened outside of her Hyman home in the past, but that night floodwaters continued to rise higher than they ever had before.
Well, my mom kept trying to warn me, like it was getting bad, and I kind of just overlooked it because this is a flood zone, and it never went over my porch.
Noble says the water eventually did go over her porch, then it started seeping into her home.
I kind of like, when it started coming in the house, and I mean, it was just like pouring into the house once it started, and I just kind of like almost hit my knees, and I kind of like screamed a little bit because I didn't know what was going to happen after that.
Noble and her neighbor Jody came up with a plan to put Noble's kids and Jody's kids on top of Jody's roof for safety.
There was 5 kids with us, and it was just me and her.
Noble says this task was even more stressful given that one of her 6-year-old twins, Carson, has special needs and is nonverbal.
My neighbor's oldest daughter is the one that held him the whole time until I got up there. And it was really scary. All I kept telling her was, don't let him go, because he didn't understand.
The group called 911, but dispatchers told them crews had no way of helping.
It's a scary feeling to think that somebody can't, get to you. Like you're on your own, basically.
Noble and the 5 kids were up on the roof while Jody was hanging from her gutter as floodwaters swept past them.
It was just the rain beating down on you, and you could hear things breaking, crashing. I didn't know if it was the house tearing apart or if things were flowing down here and going to hit into the house.
The group stayed like this for an hour and a half until Noble heard a neighbor yelling to help them.
And then when he hollered again, that's when I yelled back. And I was telling him that we had 5 kids on the roof. Jody was still on the water.
Noble's neighbor, Nathan Day, sprung into action, wading through the flood water to help rescue the 2 moms and their kids.
It was a relief, but it wasn't, because we didn't know. I didn't want to get my hopes up. I wanted to still keep that mindset of we still have to help ourselves, because we don't know if he's going to get here.
Although Day did make it to help the group, Noble says the hardest part was trusting someone else to save her kids.
Putting my children's life into somebody else's hands that I didn't hardly know.
One by one, Day and the 2 mothers worked to get each of the kids across the water to Day's driveway.
Then I jumped off the roof, and it was like jumping into a pool. I mean, it was up to my neck.
Noble says once the group was safe on higher ground in Day's home, she still could not shake the anxiety after all that had happened.
I guess I was still in shock of it all, so it felt like I just kept wanting to run away. Like I still didn't feel safe even though I was up there.
Noble adds her and her daughter Jayla still carry that anxiety with them, especially when it rains.
Jayla still, she talks about the stuff that's happened here, about losing all her animals. And I remember when it first stormed after the flood, it really bothered her.
Noble says the support that is poured in to help her family and the community has raised her spirits.
I was shocked that with all the help that we had come here, where it is such a small place, I just thought we'd be looked over.
As the weeds stand where the floodwater once was, Noble hopes her and her family can grow beyond those memories too.
I'm just glad that we did survive, and we can just find us a home and start over.
Olivia, obviously a lot of people want to forget about this, but I know this is something you'll never forget. You had just started your journalism career at WYMT when this flood happened.
Yeah, I feel like the Lord made his plan for telling me to move to Eastern Kentucky very clear when the flood hit. I had lived here for less than 3 weeks, and I moved here, I didn't know anyone. And so I remember just waking up that day, seeing everything that had happened, and I was absolutely devastated, but I didn't know what to do. And when I quickly got out into the communities, I realized how much love I have for Eastern Kentuckians and how much love they have to give. One story that I told a few days after was the story of a spunky 4-year-old little girl. Her name was Ada. And Ada had lost everything, and she had her toys and her clothes and everything in her house sitting in her front yard. But when she was walking through her house one day, she found a penny. And the words that came out of her mouth were, "I'm lucky." And I don't know how, it'll make me cry. But I remember realizing in that moment how amazing the people here are. And one day I was driving down the road. This is another story. I was driving through Knott County and drove past a woman. She was sitting on her front porch, and for some reason I felt like I needed to stop, and I did. And I got out of the car and I started talking to this woman, and she told me she didn't lose anything, but her street, the people around her had lost everything. And we sat on her porch and talked for probably 45 minutes, and all that she did and all that she wanted to do was worship. She started singing hymns, and there were tears rolling down her face. And she didn't lose anything, but the love that she had for her community and the love that she had for her neighbors just touched me. And then there's people like Kate Clements, who's a dear friend of mine. And a few days after the flood, Kate wanted to love on people through food. And 365 days later, she's still loving people. So whenever I moved here, in a matter of weeks, I quickly fell in love with the community. I fell in love with the people. And it was through something so tragic, but just the strength of Eastern Kentuckians has really, really shown.
Yeah, and you're still meeting people affected 1 year later.
Absolutely.
Tell me about what we're about to see.
Well, the story of Jennifer Ritchie and Henry Johnson it's heartbreaking, but it's a beautiful story of their love. I mean, it's truly their love story, and you wouldn't expect to find that the night of July 28th.
It was like every second I would say, I love you, because I was afraid that I wouldn't get to tell him that.
It was on the night of July 28, 2022.
We got the alert that it was going to flood. And by the time that we got to the door and the windows, it was already to the porch. There was no escaping.
Calling 911 and begging for help. But in that moment of terror for Jennifer Ritchie, her fiancé Henry Johnson, her mom, and their dogs, help was not an option.
As soon as the door burst open and the water started pouring in, we knew that it was a dire situation.
You couldn't stop it. You couldn't even shut the door because the water was pushing it.
And within 10 minutes, the water rose to chest level. Knowing that escaping might be their only choice, Ritchie's mom refused to leave the dogs behind.
And I just held on to Jennifer and said, we have to go. And I slung her out of the front door, and I went under after her.
In the darkness of night, the two clung to the gutter as cars, gas tanks, and debris rushed past them.
It was really difficult because you were afraid that the next second that you look over, they're going to be gone.
Continuing to fight for their life as the water raged for what felt like hours.
We held on to the gutters until the water rose high enough for me to get onto the roof, and I was able to pull her onto the roof. And we still not knowing the situation in the house.
Yeah.
If her mom was okay, if the dogs were still okay, we could hear the dogs screaming.
And in that moment, Ritchie assumed her mom didn't make it.
I was so afraid that I would look down and, see someone I knew.
Screaming out for help as their home was lifted from its foundation, sliding into a power pole.
Honestly, it was a lot of crying and just holding each other.
We had to hold each other, and it was pitch black. The only light you could see is when lightning would come across the sky, or a power line would go down.
As daybreak neared, Johnson's parents showed up and found them, finding a volunteer rescue team to wade through the water.
We kept hearing them saying that they were coming for us, but they had to wait for the water to get a little bit lower. And when they got to us, the gentleman, he's like, we're going to need a ladder. And then he's like, the first thing that he asked is anybody inside? And I said, yeah, my mom. He says, is she okay? I was like, I don't know.
Making his way into the home, Ritchie says she heard her mom's voice, knowing in that moment, everything was going to be okay.
I hear a clink on the side of the house, and it's this ladder, and this guy says, come down, and we slowly made our way down the ladder to the mud, and that's all that was left. There was no ground left. It's all mud that we're walking on. Our porch was gone even. I seen it rise up out of the water and pass us by.
Wading through the water, strapped to complete strangers, eventually making it to the road above their house.
Just, I don't know what I guess I had no more strength left in my legs, and I just collapsed and cried with Mom. I'm grateful for every day I have with her. I don't take anything for granted anymore because it was gone in 10 minutes. Everything that we worked for 7 years was gone in like 10, 15 minutes.
And as they reflect 365 days later, they are still waiting to thank those who saved their lives.
We saw them briefly before they moved on to help someone else, but I do want to thank them from the bottom of my heart. I really do. We need more people like them, to be honest, willing to risk their life to save a stranger.
On a day that changed their outlook on life forever.
So I try to live my life with not regretting things, taking things for granted, and just loving the people around me, because you just don't know when they'll be gone.
Loving each other more every single day because of the night of July 28th.
And I think I told him 1,000 times that I loved him that night.
So many stories of how love persevered, and you know, buddy, a lot of people were just happy to make it out of this alive. But there was also a sense right after this happened of, how am I going to make it through this?
I think that's true. You look at how massive this was and how the devastation hit so many different places. And I think the response was different everywhere because we have places that have seen this happen. They've seen this happen more than once. And then we have places where the most common thing I was hearing is, this doesn't happen here. So we have people who are prepared to move forward and they know what it takes to kind of come together. And then we also have the people who, even now today, 1 year later, are trying to find a way to rebuild their homes while they're also kind of like tearing down the walls that they built inside of themselves after all of that devastation.
Yeah, and you talked to one woman who had just an amazing story of survival.
Yeah, so Rita Bartley is one of those people who not only did the flood impact her life, but even after, it was hit after hit for her. And I think she told me during her time, one of the things that she leaned on during that time was God and good people. And for Rita Bartley, those are the only things that helped her get through the waters.
Death, and then God, salvation, the thankfulness.
Rita Bartley looks back on last year flooded with emotion.
Needless to say, there is widespread devastation in those areas.
It's wading through that nasty, muddy water that was waist deep.
She and her husband James were resting in their car, trying to regain some energy to get him in his wheelchair and back inside after a long day of doctor's appointments. When they were awoken by water pouring in on all sides of the car, Rita decided she would not leave her husband's side.
And also the thoughts that my husband couldn't even walk, and he had a wound vac.
A neighbor quickly acted, rescuing them from the raging river.
I will never, ever thank God enough, ever, for this man and for God's promises.
But when the waters were gone, the worries were still rising. And it was those promises that kept her head above.
Even though my husband's not here with me now, and he could have been taken that day, I spent another month with him, and I'm thankful. I'm thankful that he gave me that extra month, you know.
1 month after the flood, James died of cancer, leaving Rita alone and anxious.
Heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking. Well, it's happened.
And with the damage of the waters too expensive and extensive, she had to find a new place to plant herself.
I was able to come back into the house to try to get my stuff out and moved. I really had no place to go. I was just living from here to there.
Now, looking at the wood and windows, it is not the water once surrounding the structure that comes to mind.
Especially in the evenings, we would sit, we'd talk, we'd enjoy the evenings sitting on the porch. I'd love to have those back, but I have those memories and they are very precious to me.
It is the power that pulled her through.
And that he does. That he does.
And the community that she has watched rebuild, recreate, and reclaim the place they once called home.
For everyone that has suffered their losses, to be back to where they were when this devastation came, to have rebuilt, and to be back strong as they ever were, and to see, most of all, to see where their help came from.
Saying the only thing to do is push forward.
They always need to cherish their memories, and they always need to make memories every day, because you never know. You never know when that last day, how fast it can come.
Looking back on the troubled waters from higher ground.
I'm blessed. I'm blessed.
Not every story from the flood has a happy ending, unfortunately, and there are so many twists and turns that we've seen in the last year with some of these stories. Chandler, and I know you've covered many of those.
Yeah, you had people that turned into first responders that were not, and you had first responders doing their job, first responders just trying to save themselves. It was really everyone trying to step up to the plate and help out each other. There were people, I remember in the McRoberts community in Letcher County, where they had to basically set up a human chain to save somebody out of their house that was being toppled over with water. It was truly a terrifying moment.
Yeah, and you talked to a first responder in Letcher County that really has an incredible story of survival.
Yeah, and if you ask him, it was divine intervention that saved him. It's truly an incredible story. Letcher volunteer fire and rescue chief Wallace Bowling Jr. says the water bounced him and the truck he was in around like an air hockey puck between the mountainside and nearby buildings.
And it picked me and my truck up. And I'm pushed back against this garage. But I never locked the wheel on the truck. So I turned the wheel and I hit that garage.
Eventually, Bowling's truck was slammed into a tanker truck.
I mean, you can see that's my truck. That's where my truck was against this thing.
Trying to get out, Bowling shot a gun through his window and climbed on top of the tanker truck.
He landed right here. I mean, like right here. And when I shot, I'm just like diving.
Then he stayed there for 15 hours, praying for help before the water finally receded.
There's your watermark. That's how close the water was on me once it peaked out.
Bowling says his department lost more than $3.5 million in trucks and equipment.
Literally, I grew up here. I got so many memories in this place. I found out I was going to be a father here 17 years ago. So many just...
The pain and heartbreak did not end there.
Watching a lifetime of hard work float away.
With the help of other fire departments, they now have multiple trucks and increasing loads of equipment, but the rebuilding process is ongoing.
The place means the world to me. Grew up here. Got a lot of memories with my dad, kids, and it's been a lot of hard work. A lot of stuff going up, down, jumping hurdles, but overcoming, moving along, you know.
Overcoming, a word he also used to describe battling memories of that night.
Random thought through the day, or just something, not every day, but just, you know, it's something that you'll always keep in your head.
Just like that night, Bowling relies on faith to battle those memories.
I mean, I got myself into a mess and banking on the good Lord above to get me through it, which he did.
With new fire trucks, the chief looks to continue serving the community.
I grew up watching my dad do this stuff with a servant's heart. I had no means wanting to be a fireman, an EMT, a fire chief, but here I am, you know, 30 years later, doing the same thing that Dad done, you know, I guess what you could say with a servant's heart.
Along with serving the community, Bowling is making sure he takes care of himself as well.
Drink that extra cup of coffee, spend that extra 5 minutes, go on that trip to the beach to relax. it's worth it.
Continuing to live and serve one day at a time.
First responders played such a critical role right after the flood. Jordan works in our Big Sandy Bureau, and Jordan, I know you saw many examples of this right after the flood.
Definitely, Steve. I was in the Garrett area the morning of the flood, and I saw so many instances of these first responders. Their homes were being flooded too, pushing all their needs aside and saving people's lives. You know, the National Guard was in. They're credited with 500 rescues, 80 of those through the air. And these small rescue squads and volunteer fire departments, they had just as many rescues.
A lot of heroes out there for sure. You talked to another first responder who didn't get to do quite as much as he had hoped.
Yes, Bob Scott had a stroke the year before the flood and was still recovering. So he didn't get to help as much as he would have liked. In July 2021, Garrett Volunteer Fire Department Chief Bruce Scott suffered a massive stroke. 1 year later, floodwaters ravaged eastern Kentucky, including the Garrett area.
Since he had had his stroke, the water scared me a little bit more, so I was awake most of the night. And I started watching the water. I'd walk out to the little creek that's out from the house here and just see the water coming up.
Bruce, still with limited movement in his right side, was helped out of his home by his wife Kathy. But the day was not over.
When is it going to quit? I just couldn't believe that. I don't say anything to anybody. I don't want to scare her, my granddaughter. We're in the car, and it just, gosh, man, it was scary. It was scary, really was.
Both say their memory of returning to the home is fuzzy.
It was unreal, the force of that water.
Unreal.
Yeah. And so we just stood down there all day long watching the water, and when it started going down, we started getting back in the house and surveying the damage. And to this day, I cannot remember opening that door and going into the house.
Bruce and Kathy say they have been through floods before, but nothing quite to this extent, and were unsure on how to continue.
Really numb, didn't really know what to do or how to do it. If we were to do something, we didn't know what to do. We've been through this before, but you know, nothing like this flood here.
But soon after, folks came to help, including family, friends, and volunteers from across the country.
They finally got through on their side-by-side and got to us, and then we started cleaning. We had friends come in.
But Bruce was still recovering and could not help as much as he wished.
Which was really hard on him.
Very hard.
And it still is.
Yeah.
It still is.
Because I'm usually the one doing the helping. I'm not being helped. I like to help other people. So.
But the two would wade through the waters together.
When he had his stroke, we were in it together. There was no way that I was going to let him go through that alone. And just like with this flood, we went through it together.
Now, the couple has returned to their home, but with plenty more to do.
We'll never be through. Anybody that's been through one of these floods know you'll never be through with it. There's always something to be done.
And Bruce is up and helping out.
It was something that I hope and pray we never go through again.
Nobody does. Nobody.
Yeah.
Thankful to be alive and hoping to never weather a storm like that again.
There were so many rescues after the flood. We really don't know how many people were rescued, Keaton, but you were actually here in Knott County and saw some of that firsthand.
I did. I saw a few rescues actively going on because I was the morning acre that morning, so I was up bright and early, out early, and I came into Hyman, coming down the Hyman bypass, and as you do, you kind of see down into Hyman, and there's that huge hill that goes all the way down, and at the bottom of it that morning was a lake, and there were still buildings kind of floating down the river, and so I'm getting there, and people are being rescued actively, and so I'm talking to people who have been pulling people from their homes, pulling children from their homes, all night long, basically. I mean, at this point it was 7 in the morning. They had been out since 2, 3 in the morning. And they're just exhausted, and so it was quite something to come into.
Yeah, and it's just hard to believe that even where we're sitting now was underwater, and you know, so many were rescued, but unfortunately we did lose more than 40 people. And you talked to a relative of a woman who is actually still missing.
Yes, Vanessa Baker. She's kind of the last person that is unaccounted for from the floods. 44 people have died. 44 have gotten their funerals paid for by the Team Kentucky Flood Relief Fund, but Vanessa Baker and her family kind of haven't had that closure because she's never been found. And there were searches for her for months after the flood, but she was the one where they weren't able to recover her, and so she was actually legally declared dead back in January.
Anthony Mullins won't soon forget the chaos of the July flood.
Hearing the squalls and the screams of people that were washing off, but there was nothing that you could do about it. I mean, it was just a terrible few days of events and not realizing who made it and who didn't.
Mullins is the pastor at County Line Community Church. Located on the border of Perry and Breathitt County, the church quickly became a hub for flood relief.
Immediately, we turned the church into a disaster relief center and began to distribute supplies, started housing volunteers, serving meals, having those things happen here at the church.
But before there were any supplies or volunteers, Mullins was focused on making sure his family was okay.
Well, you know, the morning after the flood, I was still trying to reach my family because, you know, my parents, their home washed off. I still have, you know, my aunt's still one of the ones that's missing here a year later.
The night of the flood, Mullins' parents' home was forced from its foundation and carried downstream, crashing into the home owned by his aunt, Vanessa Baker. Mullins says he was briefly able to get on FaceTime with his mom. His father had just dove into the floodwaters to check on Baker.
And she says, "I've lost your dad," and then we lose connection with her and finally get back with her, and she says, "Dad's back," but then we have these other folks we've lost.
Mullins says they weren't able to get to Baker.
The rocks were just so big that were hitting Dad in the feet, and I only have his side of it, you know, because he's still here. He made it through it.
Mullins' family was in the devastated Lost Creek community of Breathitt County, where multiple people went missing, including his aunt Vanessa.
I would just hear the reports and the things, and you think, oh, well, surely they're going to find, and surely they're going to locate. And a year later, it's tough to realize that that never transpired.
Searches for Vanessa Baker and Nancy Cundiff lasted for months. Both were women who went missing from the Lost Creek area that night. Cundiff's body was later found, but Baker has not been seen since.
There was a lot of searches looking for folks and trying to find those that were not allocated for. But as time went on, you know, I feel like there wasn't enough searches.
And while Mullins' parents have moved into a new home, Vanessa Baker's family is left only with memories.
So all growing up, she was my next door neighbor. She worked at the school I went to. And I'll never forget every day when we would talk, it wouldn't matter what we talked about, you know, talking about school buses or talking about this, she would always end the conversation, "Now I love you." And I'll always remember that. And she cared for her family. She loved her family. And she was there for her family.
Baker worked at Marie Roberts Elementary in the tight-knit Lost Creek community for more than 30 years.
Just the other day as I was at the school, I took a photo on the outside of the building. On the last week of school, some of the students had some chalk and they wrote on the side of the building, "We love you and miss you, Vanessa." And I want her to be remembered for that because she's made an impact on every student that went through that school in the Lost Creek area.
Every person has a story. Some are tales of hope and heroism, others death and despair. As a region, we have faced tragedy, heartbreak, devastation, and turmoil, but every time we have come back stronger. The region is known for its resilience. It's known for its courage and determination. The region's face is covered with the mud and dust left behind by the receding waters. The region's hands are calloused and raw from the work it has taken to rebuild, but its eyes are shining. They behold the beauty of 1,000 neighbors helping neighbors. They see the bright future for a region the world discounted as dim. The faces you meet each day represent the many faces of the flood. So we encourage you to stop and ask, what is your flood story and how can I help?